running for this office is really about giving voice to people in the state of Washington, because in a democracy, your vote is your voice. And here in Washington State, certainly in the last 4 years with the current Secretary of State, we've seen a decline in turnout every year she's been in office. We've also seen fewer people register to vote. You know, when she started in office 4 years ago, there were 3.9 million voters in the state of Washington. She proudly announced in April of this year the 4 millionth voter in the state of Washington. So that's only 100,000 voters in about 4 years. But the reality is there's almost 1.6 million people in the state of Washington who are eligible to be registered to vote, who are not registered to vote. And that's women, young people, people of color, people who make less than $50,000 a year. So to me, the office of the Secretary of State has been in Republican hands for 52 years, and we've had, I think, some good ones really in Ralph Monroe and Sam Reed. But I believe the current incumbent is not cut from the same cloth, and I don't think that she believes what I believe, which is the Secretary of State's office is about making sure 100% of the people who are eligible are registered and 100% of those people are voting. And if that's what you believe and that's how you run your office, you'll organize it differently and you'll work on policy pieces in a different manner. I come at this with not just one sort of narrow set of experience as an election administrator, but 30 years of experience in technology, in management, in government, in nonprofits. So I'm looking at this very, very broadly to say voter turnout in the last general election in 2015 was 38%. That was the lowest ever in Washington State history. 6 out of 10 people in Washington State do not vote on a regular basis. So it's going to take someone with a different set of experiences, with good management and technology skills, because technology is such an incredibly important piece of the work of Secretary of State now, to be able to reverse that trend and make us first in the nation again in terms of voting and voting innovation.
Well, you know, take that just a step further, because that was one of my questions.
Sure.
Is you haven't had experience in elections at all. Is that a hindrance at all? How do you catch up and kind of learning that part of the business? And then what's the other part of your background that you apply to that differently?
Absolutely.
What others would?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is I think we've kind of bought into this narrative that, at least in Washington State, that only a former county auditor can be a Secretary of State. That's certainly not the case in the 49 other states in the United States, and we only have to look south to Oregon to see Kate Brown, the current governor who was Secretary of State, who really, over the last 10 years, has been the most innovative Secretary of State in the country. She was the first to usher in automatic voter registration, as well as a host of other innovations. So I think someone who comes from a much broader background really is what's needed now to make this happen. And certainly, if you look at the systems that I've been a part of, or even the government work that I've done, the election system runs by its own rules, and so do all of those other things. So again, Secretary of State is not the person who actually counts the votes, it's the county auditor, and you have a great elections administrator to work with you on all of those things in making that happen. For me, my background comes in if you look at Secretary of State, it's really 3 jobs. Your chief voting officer for the state of Washington, so she who sits in the seat does that component of it, and a lot of it is the systems and working with the legislature to look at issues like funding and policy issues. Again, a place I've got great experience as a Seattle City Council member, but also working with the legislature and working nationally to get legislation passed. The second piece of the job is corporate registrations and nonprofit registrations, and that's a business person's job. And obviously I've been a senior executive at Microsoft, have run businesses large and small inside the U.S. as well as outside the U.S., and I know we can do a better job in the Secretary of State's office around that piece of it. You know, one of the things that the current Secretary of State promised when she was in office was something that Oregon has, something that Nevada has, which is a one-stop shop or an online portal for businesses to be able to file all their paperwork with the state. So you don't have to go to Revenue, you don't have to go to L&I, you don't have to go to all of these other places to do it. She has not made that happen. She has not even taken a leadership role in any of those particular efforts. And I know that I can, and I will, because I've built coalitions like that before to deal with tough issues, but also because it really is most important for small business here in Washington State that somebody fix that. You know, small business is where we get our innovation. Small business is where we get a majority of our jobs. Small business needs that kind of investment because especially if you're starting off, again, a very small business, or you're taking a sole proprietorship and turning that into an LLC, you know, paperwork takes a lot of time. Our processes and procedures take a lot of time. Registering takes a lot of time. You know, it takes us weeks as opposed to 24 hours in the way that Oregon and Nevada do it. Same thing with our nonprofits. And on the nonprofit side, there's also a consumer protection function that I don't think has been elevated properly. I'm a former executive director of a nonprofit, and know that it's the 1% of the bad actors that impact the 99% or 99.9% really of the nonprofits that are doing a great job. So that role is split between the Secretary of State as well as the Attorney General, and there's never been a coming together over that to really look at consumer protection.
Every year,
yeah.
I just want to know,
Yeah.
you mean a little more specifically there. Every year, I think this is what you're talking about, they put out that list of, here's where your money is going when you donate to these nonprofits, kind of an analysis of, is it really having the impact it should? You go beyond that?
Absolutely, because there's much more you could do in tying in with all the philanthropic organizations here in Washington State that do those ratings. It's not just doing sort of pass-through from places like GuideStar, which is kind of what happens, but from a philanthropic standpoint and looking at what we do as a state, there's so much more here that we can be reporting on and give folks access to, and then again, making sure we're tracking down sort of the bad apples in the bushel there. The same thing is for nonprofits who really shouldn't be nonprofits. And I'm taking a look at organizations that primarily do political work, but do it under the guise of a nonprofit, and making sure that they properly have that 501c3 status, as opposed to, you know, being a PAC or a C4 or something like that, where they most likely should be, and making sure that we're cracking down on that appropriately.
You can do that in this job?
Absolutely, absolutely, you can do that.
I mean, that's not an Attorney General job?
That is a partnership between the Attorney General and the Secretary of State to make that happen, because many of the laws are really fuzzy as to where all of that is and how that works. So that's why I think that real partnership and this idea of creating a consumer-based agency is important.
Is that the third part of what you said?
No, the third,
3 jobs.
No, there's one more job. The third part of the job is Washington State Libraries, History, and Archives. And so you are telling the stories of Washington State through the histories and archives component of it, and access through the libraries. And that's been an area that has been defunded year after year after year as part of the Secretary of State's office. I don't think the current Secretary of State has fought appropriately for that, nor has she placed it in a proper context in terms of how do we take that information and that history and get it into the hands of young people more effectively in Washington State. I've talked to both of the OSPI candidates about 9th grade Washington history, which my 2 older kids have been through, and found slightly underwhelming, I would guess I would say, in terms of its context. It's not just about Lewis and Clark in our state. It's a very rich history. So how can we change that curriculum to add a citizenship component, so that you're not just getting sort of here's what the federal government does, but understanding the importance of voting, and there's also something that you would do with local government or your statewide government to understand how that works and how that impacts you as a citizen. And then also to take a look at what stories are we telling about Washington State, and then driving young people to the archives, driving them to the Washington State libraries as a resource so that they know that those exist. So many more opportunities to change how this office works.
Some of those ambitious things, especially some of the digital things that you're talking about, there's a lot of data in those archives. There's a lot of data within nonprofits, things like that. Are those jobs that the state or the Secretary of State's office itself has the capacity to really tackle, or do you have to go outside? Do you have to go work with Microsoft to get the skills to do some of this stuff? Should we be thinking about that, or is that kind of, especially with voter data?
Right.
I
think we should be thinking about partnerships all the way through. Now, again, I'm a former exec at Microsoft, so I look at the cybersecurity issues very carefully. The biggest challenge that's going to face the next Secretary of State is the complete redo of the voting technology systems in the state. The voter database, the election administration systems, the websites for the 39 counties around voting, all of those things have to be replaced. and they fall under the Secretary of State's purview to do that.
What do you mean they have to be replaced? Is that acknowledged by your
Yes,
opponent also?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's a RFI out there, request for information, to put that project through. You read through that RFI, and again, my undergrad's in computer engineering, looking at that, and it really doesn't take into account the needs of voters. The system itself is only taking it into account, and it has only had conversations with auditors around what happens to be in that system. So a big component of what's missing in there is access to information about voting, but also access to information about candidates, about elections, about all of those things that I believe in the end would increase participation if we make it easier for people to get access to that info.
How much of this information, or some of these things
Yeah.
you want to do,
Yeah.
require legislation or working with the legislature? How is that going to work?
The big sort of P policy issues certainly do. So doing things, so here's where my opponent and I disagree. I support the Washington State Voting Rights Act. She doesn't. She hasn't done anything in 4 years as Secretary of State to support it, nor has she added it in request legislation. I support automatic voter registration, a la what Oregon has done in terms of when you go in, you are automatically registered when you have a driver's license. You have to opt out otherwise. In Oregon, they've added 220,000 new voters in 8 months with automatic voter registration, which is an astounding number to do that.
Does the data say that those people then in turn
They have absolutely been voting.
vote?
They have turned out in the primary, and they anticipate, if you talk to Jeannie, who's the Secretary of State there, they will turn out in the general. So we'll see on November 8th how that works through, or in their voting process. The other components of it are same-day registration. So you know how our registration closes on October 10th, if you want to do it online or mail in. And then if you want to do it in person, it closes on October 31st. But this would allow you, like 16 other states do, to be able to go right up until Election Day, walk into your county auditor's office, register, and get your ballot. And then pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. The Secretary, to her credit, supported it for 17-year-olds, but if you look at the bulk of the data, it's between 16 and 17 where 80% of those registrations would come in. And then finally, postage-free ballots. I'm a strong proponent of postage-free ballots, and as we're seeing, 40% of the people who are voting now use drop boxes, and they cite economic reasons as the reason for doing so. And now you have sort of a crisis with this next set of ballots in Snohomish County, in Whatcom County, and in Douglas County, where they're going to have to put 2 stamps on their ballot. So it puts another...
Oh, because the ballot is that big?
The ballot is that big because they've got charter amendments and other things, so it flips over to that piece of it.
Oh my gosh.
And so for folks that are finding it hard enough to get 1 stamp, 2 stamps are just another burden in making that happen.
And young people don't purchase stamps
Exactly.
anymore. They email. They
Right.
don't send
Absolutely.
letters.
I can tell you, my 18 and 20-year-old, they wouldn't know a stamp if you tossed it at them. What's this for? And they wouldn't even know where to put it on the envelope, frankly. Yeah.
I've always thought that was more likely than can't afford it.
No, I think that it's really interesting, and we've spent a lot of time around the state. We've talked about this. I've been to 38 of the 39 counties now in Washington State on the campaign trail, talking specifically to voters around the state. And if you look at things that are barriers and disenfranchisement, stamps are definitely one of them. It's harder to get a stamp these days. When you get a stamp, you can't just buy one. You have to buy, a whole sheet of stamps. Right, exactly. And that's an issue. I'll give you one example. We were up talking to the Macaw Indian Reservation. We were on the Macaw Indian Reservation talking to the tribal council at Nia Bay. And the tribal council there, or the folks there, they voted 98% in Native elections, in their tribal elections. They voted 17% in statewide 17 in statewide elections. And so we asked them the reason why, and they said, well, we need a drop box on the reservation. I said, a drop box? It's $1,000 really for a drop box. We should be able to figure out a way to get you a drop box. And to a person, they all laughed and said, you know what, if you get elected and get us a drop box, we're going to have a celebration around that because we've been asking for 10 years for a drop box. And if you look at that, you look at Nia Bay, it's one of the poorest places in the state of Washington. If you're not fishing, you're not making money, and fishing has declined as an industry. But for a want of a drop box, you're disenfranchising 2,200 voters on the reservation. Of the 29 reservations that exist in Washington State tribal lands, not a single drop box.
Now that Dropbox question came up in Seattle last year. It actually came up in Kitsap County.
Yeah.
I think we do better than average at having Dropboxes around, if I remember right.
We do, and in Seattle did increase
Yeah, that was,
significantly the number.
they had to add a lot more.
Mhm.
Now, but when you think about your priority
Yeah.
there's only so much money to go around, how would you put drop boxes next to prepaid postage?
So
Because that's
we-
another, that's $1 million, I think
right.
that's what it was.
Yeah, so here's
Estimated
what
at.
I would do, number one, which is, there's never been a complete audit of our voting system here in Washington State. And the reality is, there's not one system, there's 39 systems, based on the 39 counties. They're funded differently, they're staffed differently, they have a certain amount of autonomy in policies and procedures, and no one's ever done an equity audit to be able to say throughout a particular county, does everyone have equal access to register and then to the ballot box? I think you have to start with those numbers to try to figure out where those priorities lie, what can counties do, and then what the state should be doing in terms of that piece of funding. If you look at the presidential primary that we had back in this past year, I was one of the folks, calling on the Secretary of State to cancel the presidential primary. I knew she couldn't cancel it, but it was an issue of looking at our broken primary system and how much money we spend on it. I believe our primary system's not working effectively for everyone in the state. We canceled it in 2004. We canceled it in 2012. The Secretary of State, the current one, said in summer of 2015, she was at the Everett Herald, and she said if both parties were not going to use the primary to allocate delegates, that she would call for the cancellation of the primary. Well, she didn't. And we spent $11.5 million in taxpayer money on that primary.
Well, but is the solution to cancel the primary, or is the solution to have the Democrats use the primary?
Well, the solution is a couple of things. Number one is, with that $11.5 million for the presidential primary, we could have bought 3 years of postage-free ballots in the state of Washington, plus drop boxes for every 15,000 county residents in the state and every college campus and native reservation. We could have purchased all of the administrative costs of same-day registration and pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, as well as another promise the Secretary has made, which is primary voter pamphlets, which don't happen in all of the counties. In fact, they don't happen in most of the counties. So to me, I am strongly in favor of primaries. I'm the Democratic candidate, and I will run up against the Democrats on this one each time, but I think that the party has gotten through these caucuses and recognized it's far outgrown the caucus process and will go to primaries. So that being said, I think we need a primary that is earlier in the cycle.
I was going to ask you,
yeah.
How early?
Yeah, I think, it would be interesting to see if we could do a Pacific Northwest primary. And I've talked to folks in both Oregon and Montana. Their primaries are in May. We could do a Pacific Northwest primary in May, where you would then have candidates come potentially for a 5-state region, in which case they would really come to do something like that. I also want to look at the August primary as well when talking about this, because again, as I've gone around the state, so many people have said August 2nd is a horrible time to have a primary. We're on vacation, we're not thinking about voting, we don't necessarily even notice that it's coming in the mailbox. So let's look at the system in total, and potentially we need to look at moving up that primary as well and have it on a consistent basis. It runs up to a couple other issues like the legislative freeze in terms of fundraising, and I don't think that incumbents will like that, so we've got to talk about that. But let's look at a way that is more voter-centric as opposed to what we do for the parties. The last piece to me around the party primaries is, if you're going to require asking if someone's a Democrat or Republican, then maybe what we should do is do what other states do, like New York, which is require those parties to pay for the primary. That's a heck of a lot of money to spend. They would not get a say in terms of how the primary is run, because of course you would just run it as a normal election, but they would end up paying for it and making that happen. So I think we need to at least have a conversation that looks at all of these pieces and tries to solve it from the voter's perspective, not from the elected officials or from the perspective of the system as it always was.
Would you worry that getting away from a primary undermines interest further? I mean, we have a kind of a problem with people saying, politics, I don't care anymore, I get sick of this stuff.
Yeah.
If you said, we don't have a primary anymore, do you risk that? Do you risk more disengagement?
I am for a primary, and I think a primary should be something that's more meaningful for folks around that. And we've seen that, I think, in other states where you saw turnout go up, where it was in those presidential primary years where they were also voting for some other folks down the ticket as well. I think where you saw confusion was when you had a presidential caucuses, then a presidential primary, then the August primary. So people were very confused as to what the heck was going on. Should I be voting?
attest to that. I
Yeah.
came from another state.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah. So I think some of it is voter fatigue, around what's on the ballot. I do think we should look at things like advisory votes. There's not been a single advisory vote to the legislature that the legislature has ever taken the advice of. So maybe that's something that we can take off the ballot, and again, that's a lot of fatigue in making that happen. I also think we need to take a look at the initiative and referendum process. I don't think that back in 1912, when the state legislature put that into play, they thought about Tim Eyman eventually making it a business, nor did they think there'd be a billionaire who would be funding initiatives and referendums. So I want to make that something that works for citizens, because it's obviously a tool that's incredibly useful, but not when you can spend $5 and, you know, get 20 different ballot titles and shop it around that way.
Okay, well, so on that point
Yeah.
about the billionaires,
Yeah.
So what do you think about this initiative that would, what do you think about the initiatives that would reduce the funding for?
Yeah, so go to a more of a public financing option with that.
Right.
So I was very supportive of the Honest Elections initiative in Seattle that's recently passed, that will be implemented in 2017 in terms of in terms of public financing. So there's a cap, and then there's democracy vouchers. So that's, to me, is incredibly important. I would have liked to have seen us wait 2 years until we've had the time to see how that worked in Seattle and sort of work the kinks out of the system. I think the current initiative, I'm still not even sure how I'm going to vote on this current initiative, because I'm pro getting the money out of politics and public financing, but there's some things around it and how it's implemented that I still have some issues with. So I'm going to spend a little more time before I decide. But fundamentally, I think the Honest Elections initiative in Seattle is going to work, and work really well. You've seen it already, where Ed Murray, who's the mayor in Seattle, is going to have his first re-election fundraiser. And so it's the cap in terms of the dollars you can take is $500, you know, for that race. And you can't, if you're a business that does business with the city of Seattle, you can't give to those races. I think that takes a lot out of it. These democracy vouchers, where people get $100 worth in $25 increments, means that so many people who normally couldn't donate to a candidate can. So you know what that means? Candidates don't spend time with the people who can write the $2,000 check or the $2,700 check or the $5,400 check, because they can't write those checks anymore. And they will spend more time talking to voters about all of these kinds of issues. And I can't help but think that that will make better candidates and a better democracy.
Tina, I've got a question about civic education.
Yes.
The league was worked very hard to bring that back into the schools.
Yeah.
Do you see the Secretary of State as having a role
Absolutely.
in promoting that?
Absolutely. I think the Secretary of State should be working with schools at all levels to promote that and to put curriculum that's available out there, and to see what we could do in conjunction with OSPI around that. I also think that we should be doing something around making sure that college students are registering to vote and getting engaged. We spent time up on in a lot of college campuses, but Western Washington University does voter registration the best of all the public college and universities in the state of Washington. This past fall, they registered 3,000 students. That's not just more than any other college or university in the state. That's more than the other colleges and universities in the state combined. And the way that they do it is, when you come in for orientation week and you pick up either your ID or your room key, there's a student registrar there saying, would you like to vote? And you know, it's not a pressure thing, but 99% of the students register to vote. If we did that on every college campus in the state of Washington every fall, public ones, and not including community colleges, we get 38,000 new young voters every year making that happen. The Associated Student Unions have been asking the Secretary of State for 2 years to help them with this and help them do something on other campuses. I propose doing a Secretary's Challenge every fall for all the different public colleges and universities, you know, percentage-wise based on the proportion of students, because otherwise potentially Wazoo or UW would always win this thing. But, you know, how can we get students registered, get the presidents of those colleges and universities engaged, and then also figure out the right way to do it at the community college level too.
What about the more rural areas of the state? One of the great complaints, and part of this is just population, but we hear it in our area, we hear it in some of the other areas south of us, that well, Seattle, they get everything they want because they all turn out. So how do you help?
Because they what? Because they're just bigger population?
Well, it's bigger population for one, but
vote.
also, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
How do you help Grays Harbor make sure all of those people are coming out, and
Right.
Okanagan County, all of those people are coming
Well,
out?
that's why this audit and the financing component of it is so important, right? Because the election systems in those counties are so dependent upon the county commissioners and what they fund. Grace Harbor County is actually a great example. I think in Grace Harbor County, the county commissioners have been starving the election system with funding. Granted, there's a lot of issues in terms of finances in Grace Harbor County, but they have one full-time election official. That's it, year-round. Their systems are incredibly slow. I sat there and watched somebody enter in, a voter registration on the Grace Harbor system. And you know what? I worked at Microsoft, and I can't even remember this version of Word that this honkin' desktop was running to be able to register and run this particular system. So that's why the financing is so important in making that happen. And that's the role of Secretary of State in looking at the equity in these issues. King County can afford, obviously, to put more money in their election system. Grace Harbor County can't, Benton can't, Asotin can't, Garfield can't. All of these places where the financing is so incredibly important in creating that equity.
So
that's why that baseline
able,
audit.
as the state, to sort of target the funding? In other words,
Well,
give
this-
more money to, proportionately at least.
And looking at those equity issues, the state of Washington has never paid its fair share of election costs, particularly in the even years where there are state legislators running and all of those folks running. California has just done a great study in terms of how do you look at election costs and how do you make sure that equity reigns in making that happen. We can also look at, again, with the use of new technologies and potentially sharing costs as well. Do we need to have ballots counted in every physical location, or are we doing ballot centers to make that happen? Are we going regionalize, right, regionalize in some of those things so that you can share equipment costs and make that work?
To be more efficient.
To be more efficient, exactly. So you're giving folks more access to that. Are we looking at other sorts of innovations too? Here in Washington State, you can vote by email, but you can only vote by email if you're active duty military or if you are an overseas voter. But active duty military means that the folks down the road, here in Bremerton, they already have their ballots because they can vote now, which is different than somebody who lives just on the outside of the baseline to do something like that. And there's an audit trail because there's a paper vote that goes in with that. But that was a guy in Ponderosa County asked me that. He said, you know what, it's 45 minutes to the mailbox for me. To be able to the post office, to be able to vote. But I got a satellite dish in my backyard. How come I can't vote by email? Now, I think the only way you can do that is if there's audit trails and a paper trail following each vote, which there is now. But potentially, let's look at some different ways for rural residents to be able to engage and make sure that their vote counts.
Is that similar on the same lines
Yeah.
with the same-day registration
Yeah.
idea? Do you think the counties have adequate resources to handle that?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think if you implement it with a whole package of reforms, the Secretary has said, oh my gosh, we'll get tens of thousands of people registering on election day then and we won't be able to handle it.
Do
Well,
you think that estimate is accurate?
no, I don't. And I think if you're implementing automatic voter registration, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, along with same-day registration, then what you won't have happen is hordes coming in on election day. But you'll have those options for people who genuinely forget and make that happen for them.
What about this, now I'll ask
Yeah,
one question about
sure.
early voting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what's your opinion of that, and how would that work in terms of, in terms of elections?
Well, we kind of do have early voting in that way, right? In terms of our own cycle, because ballots will drop on October 19th. By October 22nd, everyone will have their ballots. So they'll have a period between October 22nd all the way through November 8th to be able to vote. And generally what happens is everyone, you either vote at the beginning or you vote right at the end. And there's very few that happens here in the middle. I think to the extent that we make people more aware of the process and get them in and get them voting. And I always encourage people to vote early because then they won't get annoying phone calls from candidates like me saying, did you turn in your ballot? Please vote and come out and do that. But I do think in other states where they don't have that option, we're only one of 3 mail-in states in the country, getting to early voting in those states would increase the opportunity for folks to vote.
I'm asking an archives question.
Sure.
It's probably not as
No, I love that.
not as much of a
It's
hot
really
topic
fun.
as some of
Yeah.
the other ones, but
Yeah.
when Sam Reed was Secretary of State,
Yeah.
they did a program, and our
Mhm.
bias here is we worked
Yeah.
with him on one of them, was where they did these kind of legacy projects
Yes.
with the books about
Yeah.
certain people, certain figures in state history.
You bet. Mhm.
Did you think that was a good, I mean, it's great to have more books,
Yeah.
but was that an effective way of preserving our state's history do you have other ideas on how do we tell these stories and get people engaged?
Absolutely. Well, you know, technology is easy in terms of being able to do that online and put those stories up and have them available with curriculum as well in classrooms to be able to do that. And what I want to see is something that's more robust and more in partnership with other entities to utilize our history and archives to do that. When I was on Seattle City Council, it was the time where we went through a lot of soul searching about our libraries. And libraries we could not get a library bond issue passed. We had no plan in terms of looking at 21st century libraries. So we hired Deborah Jacobs, who came on as the city librarian, really put together a stellar plan for libraries and our history as well, which beefed up dollars to our archives too. And that was a great opportunity to be able to tell the stories and then have access in a lot of different places through a program, the Libraries for All program, that spent 10 years redoing Seattle's libraries, really making them cornerstones in the neighborhoods. Here in the archives, a lot of it too is a matter of preserving the historical documents that we have and making sure they're safe. And at the same time, the documents of government that come up every day, we don't necessarily need to keep those paper copies. After a certain time, we can digitize all of those and store those. But we need to find an ultimate home for those archival documents that we don't have. I also want to see the archives actually run by a professional archivist. We don't have that happening right now. And to me, that's incredibly important because the archiving profession, people who are professional archivists, they view how do you tag data and how you work with this very, very differently than someone who's not.
Is there a home for that role at maybe our public universities?
Yes, and I've actually talked about this. Like, for example, Central Washington University would love to take more of a role in terms of housing some of the archives, and we could literally set up throughout some of these universities much more effectively homes for various archives and groups of studies that are there. Another place that's talked about this, I've talked to a couple of community college presidents, who are now colleges. They're not just community colleges, and they would really love to see that level of academic study and that home in their facilities as well. So I think it's worth having the conversation and seeing out how to spread some of the care out and some of the cost around these things, but make it more accessible, not just have it stored in a big office building in Tumwater that you can only get to from 1 to 5 on certain days, because to me that doesn't make it living in that way for the people of Washington.
Could you talk a little bit more about this? You said your opponent is opposed to the Washington State Voting Rights Act.
Yes.
Could you, I guess I'm not that familiar with that act.
Yeah. So
the state.
Yeah, so where it came up and where you've seen it probably recently is in Yakima. So what the Washington State Voting Rights Act allows you to do is municipalities can move from at-large elections then to district-based elections.
Right.
And at places like Yakima, where they have a majority of Latino population, they've never been able to elect, previous to this, any Latinos to the city council in Yakima. Well, they sued. ACLU was a part of this. The city of Yakima defended. They paid $3 million in money to try to keep their at-large system in legal fees, and they lost. Because obviously it's something that should happen, and the Washington State Voting Rights Act is something that should pass. Pasco is now under a consent decree and working to make this happen, so they'll move to district-based elections. Wenatchee will probably be the next place to do that. And to me, it just makes common sense that cities should be allowed to move to these forms of district-based elections based on their minority population so that they can have representation in their councils to do that. The secretary will tell you, well, I only opposed it in 2012. I haven't opposed it since then. And that's a real change from her tune for 4 years and the fact that she's never had it as part of her agency request legislation. And if you talk to Luis Moscoso, the state representative who's been the prime sponsor, she has never had a conversation with him about this. So
so it's not passed at this point.
It is not passed, and the folks who have not passed it have been the Republicans down in Olympia. So the other piece of this is, and you look at all of these voting innovations, everything from the postage free to automatic voter registration, same-day registration, it's been the Republican Party that's stopped this from happening. And I maintain that it's time for a change of the person in the seat who's really going to advocate for voters, and again, bring up that data and do that county audit, the 39 county audit of our voting system. Because I think you can change legislators' minds if they're shown the data of what's actually happening within their district, but also if you make sure that the citizens in that district are also getting that same data so that they can ask their legislators that question. Why is it that we aren't able to vote or have these things or have drop boxes in these kinds of areas?
We have, it's not an exact
Yeah.
comparison, but almost the opposite, politically the opposite situation in this county
Yeah.
where county commission races,
Yeah.
primary is done by district.
Right, and then you could vote at
General,
large, yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the more liberal north end seems
Yeah.
to dominate
Yeah.
all county commissioner races
Right.
because of that. Is that the kind of thing that you think should be
Absolutely.
looked at?
I think it should be looked at in that way, and look at the ways to get the most and best representation and people engaged in elections. I mean, ultimately, as Secretary of State, it is a nonpartisan race. You know,
Is it nonpartisan?
Well, I think it's not. I mean,
Should it
the
be?
way the job works is nonpartisan. We've got a Republican running against a Democrat, and we come with all of the baggage of our respective parties and the way that we believe things. But to me, the minute you step through the door, you have to be nonpartisan and you have to be fair. So it doesn't matter to me if you're a Republican, a Democrat, Green Party, Independent. I want to make sure you're registered and I want to make sure that you're voting. That's my job as
Do you think
Secretary
it
of
should be a
State.
partisan race?
You know what, I don't know, you know, because one of the few things in these, that give people a clue in terms of how folks might be thinking about issues is that party affiliation. So I go back and forth as to whether or not it should be partisan or nonpartisan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Stan Reed always told us he thought it was okay, but
yeah,
it was the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
What am I hiding? I should
Right.
tell you where I am.
exactly, and I think that that's really important,
Yeah.
yeah.
You're not a legislator, but you do make recommendations, you have
Yeah.
kind of a list of things to do.
You bet.
What's on that list, and then my secondary question to that is, public records are
Yes.
something that is not directly related to you, but
Correct.
when you talk about archiving and things
Right.
like that, that should be important.
Mhm.
In my
Well,
opinion.
and access and transparency is a big component of public
Yeah.
records, and making sure people have easy access within the Public Records Act, so you can see what's there and what's available. I also think that the Secretary of State's office needs to have a really great relationship with the PDC as well, because I don't think that you can run elections without also talking about issues related to and advocating for funding for the PDC.
PDC is.
A Public Disclosure Commission.
Oh, okay.
To make sure the Public Disclosure Commission can do investigations in a timely manner.
Campaign donations.
Yeah, campaign donations. They have huge backlogs in terms of, well, at least the current director worked really hard to get rid of what was an immense backlog of investigations into this. But you should be able to turn these investigations over more quickly. And, you know, it's a small department, doesn't exactly have, you know, somebody out there fighting for their funding. I want to be one of the executive offices that's out there fighting for their funding. So for me, working with the legislature, sort of the big policy issues that I would fight for on my agenda. Number one is that audit, but I actually think I potentially can do that without having to ask the legislature for funding, working with the state auditor to make that happen, or potentially some outside entities. But the big policy issues for me are Washington State Voting Rights Act, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, pre-registration, and then also postage-free ballots.
Do you think
Mhm.
it's not nonpartisan yet?
Yeah.
So what if the legislature doesn't, I mean, the makeup of the legislature doesn't change?
Mhm.
How would you work with, say, a Republican
Right.
Senate?
You have to have those conversations and work across the aisle. You know, when I ran Lifelong AIDS Alliance, it was back when HIV/AIDS was still a controversial disease, and people had, you know, very differing opinions about the LGBT community. And so, but I was still able to work with the legislature and Republicans and conservatives in the legislature to view this as this is a health issue. It's a health issue that impacts all of our communities. How can we work together to get funding, which we did, for more testing, more education, more access, and insurance care, to make something like that happen. And I've done that in my role as a Seattle City Council member, working with the legislature, and then also working nationally, particularly on public safety issues through National League of Cities and other places. So I think the data of that audit is incredibly important. I'm not just going to walk into a legislator's office and say, I think you should do this because of ideology. I'm going to walk in and say, here's the data for your district and what it's showing. Here's what we could do in terms of voting. This is data we're going to make public and make sure that the public knows about it. But it's something that you should consider. And I think for your district, here are the policies that would help make voting easier in that district. And that's my job as Secretary of State, to advocate for that legislation, but also to make legislators aware of what's happening in their district and how they can help.
The League of Women Voters has been working on creating a toolkit
Yeah.
on voter turnout.
Mhm.
This is something that came from our state convention.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we found is that some people are just confused by the ballot.
Yes.
They don't understand it.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming. I like the idea of getting rid of those advisory.
Yes.
I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about making it more clear to some that are not used to,
Yeah.
dealing with forms and
Well,
government and.
You bet. Well, and also the language issues as well, related to that.
Right.
But statutorily, the ballot has to look a certain way, and the initiatives go in the federal offices, then the state offices, and then the local offices. Right. A couple of things. For the initiatives, working more to make that language more plain and more effective, I think. Many people read the initiative language, the ballot titles, and it's utterly confusing as to what's on the ballot and what that represents for them. So I think that's a partnership with the AG as well as doing work with the legislature to make that happen. The other idea that I'd like to see at least a conversation about is flipping the order in the ballot. So you would start with the local races as opposed to the initiatives and the other races. People tend to, and the political noise is all about the federal races and the presidential race. And people will vote in those races. But quite often you'll see the ballot drop off in the races that are most important to people locally, which is who's their mayor, who's their city council member, who's their county commissioner, who's their state representative. So let's look at potentially flipping that ballot so those races come first, so they actually get more attention locally around those things.
What do you think about a straight ballot, I've heard people from other states say.
You want to say vote
Yeah.
D, like just
Yeah,
click
exactly.
the D box and do all of that.
Right.
Certainly something to have a conversation about. It's one of the things I certainly remember voting with my dad, when those old voting booths with the curtains where you'd pull the lever and you could just flip D or just flip R and vote all the way down the ballot and making that happen. For a lot of our races that wouldn't necessarily play, for example, OSPI, Superintendent of Public Instruction, that's a nonpartisan race. Lots of local races too are nonpartisan races.
State treasurer.
So, yeah, state treasurer you got two, yeah, so you wouldn't be
two,
voting,
of
yeah. So it's certainly worth a conversation to think about it, but I don't know if in practice it's actually the most practical thing to have happen. And I would love to get people to the place where they actually knew those two people, they just weren't, making a choice based on a D or an R by their name.
That was interesting what you were saying about language.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but what do you think? I mean, should we print these ballots in other languages?
Well, we do print them in other languages now, but depending upon the counties to make that happen, I'd like to see us use technology more effectively and have potentially in each county more vote centers, probably libraries in different places where folks can go, and it's not just what is required because of the Voting Rights Act in certain areas where you have a certain population, so you might have to do a ballot in Spanish or Vietnamese, but that you could get a whole variety of ballots this way, and your voter's guide in all of these different languages via access in the library. So for somebody, you might have 20 people who, for example, speak Amharic in your neighborhood, but they deserve the ballot the same way as somebody who's doing it in English or Spanish.
Yeah, there are call centers.
Yeah, where you could do that too.
Translate into
Yeah.
300, 400 languages.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to use that quite a bit.
Absolutely. And I was talking to the folks at Immigrant Rights Group One America yesterday, having a long conversation about involving more immigrant communities, that people want to be able to help in the translation component of it, to do these things so that people have access to the ballot. So let's set up our statewide network to do that.
There's a candidate president who's saying things like rigged and kind of undermine the trust in elections. And it's been fairly proven that, actually Kim Wyman, we're going to publish a piece that she put out saying people should trust our elections. Our state has done a good job. But how do you get at that kind of innuendo that goes around about we can't trust, or especially when you're making change in digital tools and things like that. Right. How do you make sure we retain people's trust?
Well, I think, I think first of all, everyone should disavow Donald Trump and everything that he says and does, but that's my personal opinion around that. I think there is concern around election systems and the opportunity for hacking and cybersecurity issues around that. You know, our own campaign exposed a flaw in the voter database just a few weeks ago that's been around from 2012. We were able to get in through the back door of the My Vote app and get access to all 4 million voter records in the state of Washington, and information that it's illegal for someone to be able to access and get. So in addition to getting somebody's voter information, we were able to get their home and cell phone numbers, their email addresses, their military status, all these things around ballot information. And the Secretary's office, in my mind, has not done a good job in terms of that cybersecurity piece. So I think we all need to ratchet this up and take a look at this very, very seriously in terms of cybersecurity access and how we work through these different systems. It's not enough just to do a cybersecurity audit once a year. You have to be stress testing constantly and working through those systems. And in other places around the country where they are using voting machines that don't necessarily have an audit trail, to me that's a big issue. Here in Washington State, we actually have a paper trail in terms of having a physical ballot and that audit trail. That is great, and that will help us out tremendously in terms of, it does help us out tremendously in terms of recounts and other sorts of things. But as we are changing the system, and again, that's the big thing that's going to happen in the next 4 years for the Secretary of State, we need to make sure that we're taking this security issue far more seriously than I think it has been in the past.
So the budget, let's talk about the budget. I mean, you
Sure.
have a lot of ideas here.
Sure.
What is that gonna do? I mean, can you do any of these with the budget you have?
Look at the Secretary of State's office right now. It's a $75 million budget. It's 275 employees currently. The things that we're talking about right now are in the realm of $10 to $20 million in terms of a fix. $10 to $20 million, if you remember Ross Hunter, who used to be the House budget chair, he would call that budget dust. It's not an insignificant amount of money, but in the context of the $1 billion, for example, that the state of Washington spends on technology, it's not a lot to make sure things are secure, to go through and do these pieces of legislation that are voting innovations, and then also to look at fair financing, I think, of our election systems throughout the state. There is an opportunity to do that. I think you need to build the case. And again, I think you build the case by doing this audit on the system, really looking at performance, really looking at the financing issues, and making the case for that and those kinds of numbers and doing it. Nobody's done that in the last 52 years, and I think that that's at one end a missed opportunity, and at the other end, kind of sad, because it's a great way to make sure that people are voting. With this Secretary of State, every year she's been in office, voter turnout has gone down. Every year she's been in office, and not insignificant amounts, 17%, 14%, 10%. There's a great article that's out there today from the Northwest Progressive Institute that sort of shows how that's happened over the last 4 years on her watch, comparing the previous 4 years. And she will tell you that the only thing that drives people to vote is something interesting on the ballot. Well, if that was the case in 2015, that general election, which was the lowest turnout ever in Washington state history, we had a big fat Tim Eyman initiative that had tons of money behind it. It should have driven people to the ballot box in droves, and it didn't. I believe there's so much more that needs to happen other than trying to put something sensational on the ballot to try to drive turnout. I believe you have to look at this at the local level, and things like what we talked about in Nia Bay. Is it a missed drop box? Is it getting young voters to the polls? Is it making sure that people are getting ballots in their languages? And there's those overarching big policy issues that I talked about, but where it really happens is in the counties and in the precincts, and having a Secretary of State who's going to pay attention to those details and making sure that the voters have access.
We can get those little stickers back.
I want to, you know what I want to do? Well, first of all, I'd love to.
How does it work?
You know what, I think we can do it for you virtually. And here's how. So we look at, I think about my kids 18 and 20 and what gets them to vote, right? Because I have to sit there and remind them, did you turn in your ballot? Did you turn in your ballot?
Oh, I know.
So, right. So let's use something that's cheap and easy technology that most everyone uses, which is texting technology. And if you look at minority populations as well, the highest percentage of smartphone penetration is in the Latino community, for example. So texting is a big deal. So 4 weeks out, you get a text that says, hey, the election's happening in 4 weeks, get ready to vote, and here's a link to the online voter guide. You get one at 3 weeks, you get one at 2 weeks, you get a link that says, hey, your ballot should be in your mailbox. If it's not in your mailbox or you can't find it, respond with the word help to this text and we will make sure that you get your ballot. And then when your vote is in and it's counted, you get a text that says, thank you so much for voting and for doing your duty as a citizen. Maybe some information that says, here's how your neighborhood voted, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. And here's your little I voted virtual sticker that you can put up on your Facebook page or send it up on Twitter or Snapchat or whatever you're using, or even just print it out as well to make that happen. I also want to have voter information accessible to people year-round. So you might be familiar with an application called Neighborhood Walk Score. Neighborhood Walk Score, which is taking a look at neighborhoods and what their walk score is, their walkability, like access, and access to things like transit and all of that. It's really easy to do something that's a neighborhood vote score. You know, that would not tell you how your neighbor voted, obviously, but in your precinct, in your neighborhood, it would say, hey, 20% of the people in your neighborhood are registered, and 20% of that, and 5% of that 20% is voting. That might just spur you to be able to act to say, I'm going to do a voter reg drive and knock on some doors or talk to people about voting and get those numbers up. And that's a way to build up those numbers. And again, using really cheap technology to do something like that, stuff that's been around for a long time.
I think a lot of times the people at the local level,
Yeah.
they don't understand that voting in and of itself
Yeah.
boosts their significance as a community.
Absolutely, yeah.
However they vote, just the voting.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think, you know, how we do all of these sort of looking at neighborhoods and health scores for neighborhoods, right? And what makes a healthy neighborhood, what makes a healthy city. To me, voting and civic engagement needs to be an indicator and an important component of that. To me, as a citizen, voting is sort of your baseline civic engagement. If you get people voting, they'll understand issues more, they'll get engaged more, they'll start to volunteer more, they'll start to do other sorts of things in their neighborhood as well. And I think that that's why, even though we probably won't get to 100% of the people eligible registered and 100% of those people voting, that will be the goal of my office as Secretary of State. Because again, if that's your goal, you will change how that office is organized considerably. You will change how that office works considerably. And I believe that that's the value and that's the advocacy component of Secretary of State. I don't think that it's an officer in the Washington State Constitution to be an elections clerk. I think it's to be there to make sure that voting happens and that democracy, you know, has a robust component of people who are participating.
When you talked about the kids, 16, 17,
Yeah.
getting them ready, hold on a second.
Sure, no
Get my
worries.
thought out of my head first.
Yeah.
There's a notion that not all that voting is more than just here you get to do it, figure it out on your own. But
Right.
there's some responsibility, like we should actually understand what we're voting about.
Right.
And I know there's sensitivity because you don't want to get into that neighborhood poll tax or, you know, those sorts of ideas
Sure.
either, so we're putting barriers in. But do you think there's something, you know, when you're talking to those 16, 17-year-olds, not only you get this, but
Yeah.
how do they earn it? They have to earn it too, don't they? Don't they need to, hey kid, you gotta prove that you understand what you're voting about. How would you do?
Well, I don't know that anyone has to prove that
Disagree
necessarily,
with
but
me?
I do think the Secretary of State's office needs to do a better job about access to the information where they can make an informed vote and encourage folks to vote. Look, every study will tell you if you can get kids early and start them voting at 18, they will keep voting. If you miss them at 18 and it goes into their 20s, the cost, you know, we used to call it Microsoft, the cost of acquisition, right, for a customer, in this case the voter, goes up dramatically to try to get that person back to be able to vote. So you get them at 18, they will be voters. And if you get them at 18 with information, and as a Secretary of State's office, you're presenting a variety of places to get information, nonpartisan places. This is not sort of saying, you know, here, go to this particular candidate's website, but here you can go to League of Women Voters, here you can go to the Voters Pamphlet, here you can go to other nonpartisan places where you can get that voting information.
411.
Right, exactly, to make that happen and encourage people to do that. And certainly in high school, if you are engaged in sort of civics information, you could be teaching them about these sources in 9th grade. You know, and they're not going to lose that, and they're not going to not participate.
Maybe that's what I'm asking. Is there
Yeah.
a way for you to kind of push curriculum or?
Absolutely. That 9th grade history is a sweet spot to do it. Perhaps we should require you know, graduation, most high schools now for graduation have some community service component as well. Perhaps trading in 5 community service hours for registering to vote is a proper trade-off in making that happen. I know for my older daughter that wouldn't have been an issue. She graduated with like 5,000 community service hours. For my oldest son, he would have traded 5 hours of community service for registering to vote in a minute. But you know, it doesn't matter. Anything you can do to encourage that and make that happen and have it show up in multiple places. I also want to be the Secretary of State that makes sure there's voting reg forms on every legislator's desk, you know, in their offices, in their local offices, that, you know, the governor is talking about this, that I am pressing every single elected official and department head to somehow talk about voting and participation in everything that they do. And imagine if you can amplify that message in that way, and you do that statewide at the local level too. So you're talking mayors, county council members, all of that. You know, let's have the Secretary of State be a leader in making that happen.